The Chowchilla Nightmare. The biggest mass kidnapping in U.S. history didn't involve a bank or a plane. It involved a school bus. It all happened in 1976 in Chowchilla, California. 26 kids, ages 5 to 14, and one driver, Ed Ray, gone without a physical trace. It was a Thursday afternoon, July 15th. The kids were heading back from a summer school field trip to the local fair and the pool. The driver, Ed Ray, a kind local farmer, spotted a white van stopped in the middle of the road with its hood up. It looked like someone was having car trouble. Ed Ray did what any decent person would do. He slowed down to help, but that was a fatal mistake. 3 men stepped out of the shadow. They didn't have faces. They wore nylon stockings pulled tight over their head, warping their features, and they carried sawed-off shotguns. In seconds, the kids' laughter turned into total silence. They hid the bus in a patch of bamboo brush and packed the 26 kids and the driver into 2 enclosed vans, no windows. Before they were buried, they spent 11 hours riding around inside those dark vans. 5-year-olds crying, not knowing if they'd ever see their parents again, wetting their own clothes out of fear, being driven aimlessly across California. But what happened over the next 30 hours wasn't just a kidnapping. It was an attempt at a group burial. The kidnappers took them to a quarry about 160 kilometers away. They forced the kids to climb down through a hatch in the ground. Down there, the horror was waiting. An old moving van, buried under meters of dirt and debris. It wasn't a hideout. It was a giant coffin for 27 people. Inside, total darkness, crushing heat, limited food and water. The makeshift fans stopped when the batteries died. The air started running out, and it felt like that was it for those kids. But before we get to what happened to them, we hit the $5 million question. Why do this? And honestly, who could be this cruel to innocent children? You might picture terrorists or desperate criminals. Wrong. The kidnappers were Frederick Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers, 3 rich kids, young guys from wealthy, respected California families. They weren't starving. They had trust fund, but they got buried in bad deals and wanted quick, easy cash. Their inspiration? A movie they'd seen on TV where a ransom got paid perfectly. They treated the kidnapping like a business project. The plan was to demand $5 million for the kids' return. But here's where their master plan fell apart in the most ridiculous way. After burying the 26 kids and the driver, the kidnappers tried to call the tiny Chowchilla police station in a town of just over 7,000 people to make their ransom demand. But the missing bus was already national news. The station's phone lines were jammed. Desperate parents and hundreds, maybe thousands of journalists from all over the world were calling at the same time. The small town's phone system basically collapsed. The kidnappers tried calling. Busy. Tried again. Busy. They couldn't reach anyone to ask for the money. So what did these geniuses do? They gave up for the night. They decided to take a nap, confident the buried van, which they called the Hole, would hold the victims until the phone lines cleared the next morning. They went to sleep. But down there in the dark, the air was running out and the roof was starting to give way. The kids knew they didn't have until morning. The older ones later described the most terrifying sound of all. The wood overhead cracking, bending under the weight of all that dirt above them. The ceiling was collapsing. If they waited for the ransom, they would have died from lack of air. The driver and a 14-year-old boy, Michael Marshall, decided they weren't waiting. They stacked filthy mattresses up to the roof, forced an opening, and dug through meters of dirt and industrial debris until they finally saw sunlight. When the kids and Ed Ray finally came up out of the ground, they looked like ghosts, covered in dust, completely exhausted. They walked up to a quarry guard who could barely believe what he was seeing. He told them, "The whole world is looking for you." But while the parents cried with relief, the police had a problem. Who did this? The kids never saw faces. The vans had no useful fingerprint. On top of that, the trauma was so intense that the driver, Ed Ray, basically went into a complete mental shutdown. He should have been the most reliable witness, since he was the only adult, but he couldn't remember anything about the kidnappers, so the police turned to a technique that was controversial at the time: forensic hypnosis. Dr. William Kroger put Ed Ray into a trance to reach memories that had been locked away by trauma. And here's the detail that separates real life from Hollywood. Under hypnosis, Ed Ray started reading out the kidnappers' license plate numbers, but he said the sequence backwards. Why backward? Because his brain recorded the exact visual image he saw in the bus's rearview mirror during the ambush. That plate belonged to a van registered to Frederick Wood. Police raided Wood's father's property, which ironically belonged to the owner of the very quarry where they'd been buried. And there they found what they needed, a handwritten draft of the ransom note, crumpled up in the trash. Deep down, they were sloppy amateurs. Frederick Woods tried to run to Canada, but he got caught by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The Schoenfeld brothers turned themselves in. All three rich kids were sentenced to life in prison. The judge was blunt. They stole the childhood of 26 people. End of story? Unfortunately, no. This is where true crime turns sad. A body can get out of the hole, but the mind can stay down there. Ed Ray was praised as a hero. He got parades, thank you letters, but he never truly recovered. He died years later, carrying crushing guilt for not being able to stop the kidnapping, even with a gun pointed at his head. And the kids? A well-known psychological study followed them for years. They found the kids developed something called omen formation. They started believing normal things like a broken-down car, lightning, or a stranger staring were supernatural signs that something terrible was about to happen again. Many slept with the lights on and weapons under their pillows, well into adulthood. And to add one more injustice to this already brutal story, over the decades, the kidnappers with expensive lawyers managed to get parole. The last one, Frederick Woods, was released recently in 2022. He's free, but for the 26 kids from Chowchilla, the sound of dirt falling onto the roof of that van never stopped echoing. The crime of the century. It all happened in 1932. The target, the baby who became the most famous child on the planet, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., just 20 months old. His father, Colonel Lindbergh, was an untouchable American hero, the man who flew solo across the Atlantic. He believed his family was safe inside their isolated mansion in Hopewell, New Jersey. But on the night of March 1st, that illusion of safety shattered. Between 8 and 10 at night, while the wind covered the noises outside, someone climbed up to the second floor using a ladder. When the nurse, Betty Gow, went to check the crib at 10 p.m., she found nothing but emptiness. The window was open. There were no scream, no witnesses. Lindbergh's first reaction was painful denial. He told his wife, "Anne, they stole our baby." Deep down, he still thought it had to be some kind of sick joke, but it wasn't. And worse, the crime scene was basically a canvas of confusing clues. On the windowsill, a white envelope. Inside, a ransom note demanding $50,000. The writing was odd, full of grammar mistakes and German-sounding phrases like gut instead of good. But the weirdest part was the signature. It wasn't a name, it was a complex symbol. 2 linked blue circles with a red oval in the middle, plus 3 holes punched into the paper. A creepy attempt to create a trademark for the crime. Outside, sunk into the garden mud, was the key piece. A rough wooden ladder, handmade, broken into 3 parts. Police arrived and in the panic made rookie mistakes. The frantic search by the family and officers destroyed footprints in the mud. The scene got contaminated. Months of agony passed. The ransom was paid, but the baby never came back. And later, the worst happened. The child's body was found in May, in a shallow grave just 6 kilometers from the house. The autopsy revealed a crushed skull. He had died the night of the kidnapping, probably dropped when that badly made ladder broke during the escape. No fingerprints, no witnesses. The case felt impossible, but that's where science steps in. And the hero of this story didn't carry a badge, he carried a microscope. Arthur Kohler was a wood expert, a specialist in xylotomy, working with the United States Forest Service. He did an old-school analog deep research that went down in history. Kohler took the crime ladder apart and studied every splinter. He identified 4 types of wood: North Carolina pine, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and birch. Under the microscope, he noticed tiny marks left by the tool used to smooth the wood. The plane's blade was chipped. That was basically a mechanical fingerprint. Kohler traced that specific wood from a forest in South Carolina to a sawmill and finally to a lumber yard in the Bronx, New York. That narrowed the suspect list from everyone in America to carpenters in the Bronx. When police finally arrested Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant and carpenter, who was spending the marked ransom money, Kohler delivered the finishing blow. He went to Hauptmann's house, climbed up into the attic, and looked at the floor. One plank was missing. Kohler took one of the ladder's side rail, the piece he had cataloged as rail 16, and placed it over the gap in the attic floor. It fit like a movie scene. The growth rings lined up perfectly, but the final detail was brutal. Old nail holes in rail 16, lined up down to the millimeter with the attic floor joists. The criminal mastermind had ripped up the floor of his own house to build the tool used to take the baby's life. The psychology here is chilling. Hauptmann was a skilled carpenter. He had the ransom money in his head, but the greed and ego were so big that he'd rather cannibalize his own home than spend a few cents on fresh lumber. Bruno Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair in 1936. He swore he was innocent to the end, claiming a conspiracy, but wood doesn't lie. The theater of the mind. The mystery this time was inside the victim's head. This kidnapping wasn't about money, it was about taking over someone's mind. The year was 1974. The setting was Berkeley, California. The victim was American royalty, Patricia Hearst, 19 years old, granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the media tycoon who inspired the movie Citizen Kane. She was a regular college student, living a quiet life with her fiancé, until the night of February 4th. A group of radicals stormed her apartment. They beat her, dragged her out, screaming in her nightgown, and threw her into the trunk of a car. The kidnappers called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, a big, dramatic name for what was, in reality, a messy group of extremists led by a white guy who thought he was some kind of prophet. But as ridiculous as they sounded, their method of torture was brutally effective. They didn't demand money right away. They wanted her soul. Patricia was locked inside a closet, not a small room, a clothes closet, 57 days, almost 2 months living in total darkness, in suffocating heat, blindfolded, without the freedom to move around. During that time, she was put through a form of psychological warfare called sensory deprivation, mixed with non-stop indoctrination. They flooded her mind with political propaganda, death threats, and occasionally lessons about how society and her family were fascist insects. When you're in the dark, terrified, you're going to die, and the only hand feeding you is the same one brainwashing you. You start to lose track of what's real, and then the transformation happened. The world heard it all through audio tapes sent to the press. In the first tapes, you hear a terrified girl begging her parents, but on the tape from April 3rd, the voice changed. The tone was cold, almost robotic. She said, "I chose to stay and fight." She wasn't Patricia anymore. She introduced herself as Tanya. The final shock came on April 15th. Security cameras at the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco captured the group's robbery, and there she was, not tied up in a corner, but right in the middle of it, holding a carbine, yelling orders at the hostages, ready to shoot. The image of the terrorist heiress hit every newspaper. The American public turned on her. She's a villain, a lot of people said. When she was finally captured, weighing only 40 kilos and staring with this empty look, the legal and psychological battle began. The defense argued brainwashing and Stockholm syndrome. They said she regressed into a childlike state to survive. If the monster says the sky is green, you agree the sky is green or you die. The prosecution, though, told a different story. A rich, rebellious girl who saw a chance to play revolutionary and found it exciting. So where's the truth? We don't really know. The most likely answer is that Patricia saw Tanya as a way to survive. She became what she needed to be. But that's still speculation. I'm not putting my hand in the fire for anybody. In the end, she was convicted, imprisoned, and later pardoned by President Clinton. Today, she lives a suburban life, raises dogs, and tries to forget the terror she lived through. But her case left the whole world with a disturbing question. We like to think our personality is strong and unshakable, but Patricia Hearst proved that with enough fear and the right closet, anyone can be rewritten. The disguise of faith. Elizabeth Smart was 14 years old. She was asleep in her bedroom in an upper-middle-class Mormon home in Salt Lake City in 2002. But in the middle of the night, Brian David Mitchell broke into the room. He put a knife to her throat and silently took her away, while her little sister pretended to be asleep, frozen with fear. Where did he take her? To another state? To a basement? Number. He took her into the mountains right above her house, and and that's where she lived her worst nightmare. Elizabeth spent 9 months living in makeshift camps, often just a few miles from her own family. She could hear search parties calling her name. She heard the dogs, but she couldn't answer. Imagine the panic of having help that close and being powerless to do anything. Her captor, Brian David Mitchell, wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was a street preacher, a delusional religious fanatic who wrote his own manifesto, the Book of Emmanuel, David Isaiah. He believed he was a prophet and that Elizabeth was a new wife given by God for his heavenly harem. He changed her name to Shir Jashub. To him, she was a valuable object handed to him by God. So how did he hide one of the most wanted teenagers in America for 9 months? He used the perfect disguise for that place and that time, religion. Mitchell forced Elizabeth to wear long robes and a white veil that covered her entire face. They went out in public. They walked the streets of Salt Lake City. People saw that strange trio, a bearded man dressed like a prophet, a woman who was his wife and accomplice, Wanda Barzee, and a figure covered in white. But nobody wanted to confront the weird religious guy. The most agonizing moment in this story happened at the Salt Lake City Public Library. A detective approached the group. He found the clothes suspicious and, without realizing it, ended up face to face with Elizabeth Smart. The detective said, "I need to see her face. Take off the veil." Mitchell, with the arrogance of a madman, replied, "No, my religion forbids it. Only the husband can see her face." And the detective backed off and simply let them walk away. You might be thinking, why didn't she scream? She was standing right next to a cop, and the answer was under the table. While the detective was talking, Wanda Barzee was squeezing Elizabeth's leg hard. It was their signal. If you open your mouth, we'll kill you, and we'll kill him. Was Elizabeth's silence cowardice? Maybe, but she knew that officer wasn't ready to stop an immediate stabbing, and she also knew those two were crazy enough to do it in public if they had to. Elizabeth watched her chance at freedom walk right out the library door. But the nightmare did end. Fate gave her a second shot 9 months later, in March 2003. The trio was walking down State Street in Sandy, a Utah suburb. This time, it wasn't a detective who noticed them, it was regular people. Two couples saw that prophet-looking guy and the covered-up girl and called the police. "We think we just saw the smart girl," they said. Within minutes, police surrounded the group on the sidewalk. And here's the most disturbing part of the rescue. The officers asked her name. She didn't shout, "It's me, save me," she said. "My name is Augustine. I'm their daughter." She was wearing a gray wig, sunglasses, and loose clothes. Mitchell had drilled fear into her so deeply that even surrounded by armed officers, she still kept obeying her kidnapper. Meanwhile, Brian Mitchell started singing religious hymn loudly, trying to intimidate the officers and stir up chaos. But this time, they didn't back down. The officers realized they weren't going to get the truth while she was still close to him, so they separated them. They cuffed Mitchell and put Elizabeth alone in the back seat of a patrol car. And there, away from the prophet's stare, the mask finally fell. The officer asked her to take off her sunglasses. When she did, he saw the eyes that were on missing posters all over America. He asked again, "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" She started crying, shaking uncontrollably, and with her voice almost disappearing, she finally broke 9 months of silence. "I'm Elizabeth Smart." Elizabeth went home that day. But what about the monsters? What happened to the prophet and his faithful wife? Brian David Mitchell, the man who claimed he was sent by God, was exposed in court for what he really was, a narcissistic predator. The defense tried to argue insanity, saying he was too mentally ill to stand trial. But the jury didn't buy it. He knew exactly what he was doing. In 2011, he was sentenced to federal life in prison with no chance of parole. He's still alive today, rotting in a maximum security prison in Arizona, where his prophecies mean nothing. But the story of his wife, Wanda Barzee, has a much more bitter ending for the rest of us. Remember the woman squeezing Elizabeth's leg under the table at the library? The woman who helped kidnap her and keep her trapped. She played the system. Wanda cut a deal. She agreed to testify against her husband in exchange for a lighter sentence. She claimed she was also his victim, that she'd been brainwashed too. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And here's the part that's hard to swallow. In September 2018, Wanda Barzee was released. She served her time and walked out. Today, she's alive and living free. She's in her 70s. She's on the sex offender registry, but she still walks around like any other free citizen. Elizabeth Smart, with remarkable grace, said at the time of her release, "I don't think she's a safe person, but I'm not going to let her presence steal my happiness again. Mitchell will die in prison. Barzee will die free. Sometimes human justice is just paperwork, not what someone truly deserves." Today, Elizabeth is a powerful activist, and she even got a Netflix documentary telling her story. The Invisible World. What you're about to hear isn't just a kidnapping, it's a psychological horror movie that lasted 18 years. It all started in 1991 in South Lake Tahoe. JC was only 11 years old. She was walking to her school bus stop. Her stepfather Carl was watching from the porch. He saw a gray sedan pull up. A woman grabbed JC and the driver hit her with a stun gun. Carl saw everything. He jumped on a bike and tried to chase the car, but they vanished into the morning fog. For 18 years, JC was presumed dead, but she was alive, and she was living in a place that doesn't even make sense. She was taken to the city of Antioch, California, to a normal suburban neighborhood full of neighbors. Her kidnappers, Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy, hid her in their backyard. Garrido built a bizarre compound of sheds, tents, and tarps behind the house. It was a filthy maze, cut off from sound and from the world. That's where JC grew up. And here the story turns sickening. Philip Garrido assaulted JC over and over. She became pregnant. At 14, she gave birth to her first daughter in that backyard, alone, with help only from the kidnapper's wife. 3 years later, she had another daughter. JC raised both girls in that filthy backyard. The kids grew up believing Garrido was their father and that JC was their older sister. They never went to school, never saw a doctor. The backyard was their entire universe. But the real tragedy of this case isn't just what Garrido did. It's what the state didn't do. Philip Garrido wasn't some anonymous guy. He was a convicted offender, a registered sex offender on parole. Police and parole officers visited his house dozens of times over those 18 years. They walked inside, had coffee, talked with him. There were thick power cables running from the main house, across the grass, all the way into the backyard, feeding electricity to the sheds where JC and the babies were living. Not one agent asked, "Where do those wires go?" or "What's back there in your yard?" Neighbors called the police saying they'd seen kids living in tents out back. Police went over, knocked on the door. Garrido said it was nothing, and they left. There were ghost children living there, and the bureaucracy basically chose not to look. And why didn't she just run? Because JC wasn't trapped by physical chains, at least not most of the time. She was trapped by psychological control and the threat that if she tried to escape, Garrido would hurt her daughters. So how did this 18-year nightmare end? Not because of brilliant police work, because of Philip Garrido's stupidity and arrogance. In 2009, he started spiraling since he was using a lot of methamphetamine. He thought he had divine powers and wanted to put on an event at the University of California, Berkeley. He went onto campus to hand out his unhinged flyers, and he brought his 2 daughters with him. The girls, who were now teenagers, wore strange clothes and acted extremely shy. 2 university staff members, Lisa Campbell and Allie Jacobs, got a bad feeling. They found his behavior around the girls scary, checked his background, saw he was a convicted offender, and called his parole officer. Garrido was ordered to come in for a parole meeting the next day. He brought his wife, his 2 daughters, and JC, who he introduced as Alyssa. During questioning, the officers finally separated the girls from Garrido. They asked JC who she was. At first, she lied, repeating the story Garrido had drilled into her. But the officer stayed patient and kind. She said Garrido had already confessed, which was just a bluff. That's when JC broke. After 18 years of carrying the secret, she said 3 freeing words: "I'm JC." The reunion with her mother, who never stopped searching, became one of the most emotional moments in American crime history. JC, now 29, introducing her 2 daughters to the grandmother they didn't even know existed. And the monsters? Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years in prison. He'll die there. Nancy Garrido, the wife who helped with the birth and the kidnapping, got 36 years. JC Dugard wrote books, raised her daughters with privacy and dignity, and founded the JAYC Foundation to help families recover from trauma. If this deep dive changed how you see these cases, subscribe for the next investigation. And remember, the truth's in the details.